In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But what if I told you that every battle, every betrayal, every moment of desperate hope across the galaxy serves a single, incomprehensible purpose? What if the greatest threat to humanity isn't the ravenous Tyranids or the soulless Necrons, but something far more insidious, something that feeds on the very thing that makes us human, our dreams, our ambitions, our unrelenting desire for change. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the most disturbing revelation in Warhammer 40,000. Today, we're diving deep into the machinations of the architect of fate himself. We're going to expose the master plan of Tzeentch, the Chaos God, who doesn't just watch the galaxy burn. He lights the matches and hands them out to anyone foolish enough to believe they're in control of their own destiny. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Tzeentch is arguably the most dangerous entity in the entire 40K universe. We'll explore how his influence stretches across millennia, how he orchestrated the downfall of Magnus the Red, and why every prayer whispered in desperation, every scheme hatched in darkness, ultimately serves his unfathomable design. But first, let me give you a glimpse of just how deep this rabbit hole goes. Picture this: the Horus Heresy, the most catastrophic civil war in human history, wasn't just a rebellion against the Emperor. It was a carefully orchestrated symphony of corruption, with Tzeentch conducting every note. The scattering of the Primarchs as infants, his opening move. The corruption of Magnus the Red, a masterpiece of manipulation spanning centuries. The current state of the Imperium, locked in eternal warfare and stagnation, exactly as he planned. You see, while Khorne revels in mindless slaughter and Nurgle spreads his gifts of decay, Tzeentch plays a game so complex that even his fellow Chaos Gods serve as unwitting pawns. He doesn't need to corrupt through despair or rage. Instead, he offers something far more tempting: the promise of knowledge, the fulfillment of ambition, the hope for a better tomorrow. And that's what makes him absolutely terrifying. Now, before we descend into the labyrinthine depths of his schemes, you need to understand what Tzeentch truly represents. He isn't just a god of magic or change. He is the living embodiment of possibility itself. Every dream you've ever had, every goal you've set, every moment you've wished things could be different, you've fed his power. He doesn't exist despite hope and ambition. He exists because of them. This is the Chaos God, who sees every possible future simultaneously, who understands causality so perfectly that he can set events in motion knowing exactly how they'll ripple through time to achieve his desired outcome. While mortals struggle to comprehend what might happen tomorrow, Tzeentch orchestrates events that will bear fruit millennia in the future. The terrifying truth is that Tzeentch doesn't need to force anyone to serve him. He simply offers them what they already want: power, knowledge, the chance to change their circumstances. And once they take that first step down his path, they discover that every choice they make, every victory they achieve, every moment they believe they're acting of their own free will, they're actually dancing to his tune. But how did such a being come to exist? What cosmic forces could birth something so fundamentally opposed to orderty? The answer lies in the very uncertain nature of sentient existence itself. Tzeentch was born from the collective hopes, dreams, and ambitions of every thinking being in the galaxy. Unlike his brother gods, who feed primarily on negative emotions, Tzeentch thrives on what we might consider positive human traits. The scientist seeking to unlock the secrets of the universe, the politician dreaming of a better society, the soldier hoping to return home safely, all of them unknowingly contribute to his power. This fundamental connection to hope and aspiration makes Tzeentch's corruption particularly insidious. He doesn't need to break people down with despair like Nurgle, or drive them to mindless rage like Khorne. Instead, he elevates their existing desires, amplifies their ambitions, and offers them the means to achieve their goals. By the time they realize the true cost of his gifts, they're already so deeply ensnared in his web that escape becomes impossible. Consider the dark age of technology, humanity's golden era of progress and discovery. This wasn't just a time of scientific advancement. It was Tzeentch's moment of supreme power. Every breakthrough, every leap forward in understanding, every ambitious project to improve the galaxy fed directly into his strength. While Khorne and Nurgle languished at their weakest, Tzeentch ruled supreme over the warp, his influence so vast that he effectively made the realm of souls his personal domain. But power, even divine power, breeds resentment. The other Chaos gods, witnessing Tzeentch's dominance, did something unprecedented in the history of the warp. They set aside their eternal conflicts and united against him. The war that followed was so catastrophic that its echoes still reverberate through reality today. During that final, desperate battle, faced with certain defeat at the hands of his united brothers, Tzeentch made a choice that would define the next 40,000 years of galactic history. Rather than accept destruction, he crystallized his own essence and cast a great spell upon himself. As his enemies hurled him against the endless mountains of the warp, his form shattered into countless fragments, each containing a piece of his divine consciousness. These fragments scattered across space and time, weakening Tzeentch but ensuring his survival. More importantly, this catastrophe marked the beginning of widespread psychic phenomena in real space. Every psyker who has ever lived, every manifestation of sorcery, every moment when the boundary between the material universe and the warp grows thin, traces back to this moment of divine fragmentation. Though diminished from his former glory, Tzeentch slowly began to reconstitute himself, gathering his scattered essence while simultaneously adapting to his new circumstances. What might have been a defeat became another layer of his grand design. His fragmented nature now allowed him to exist in multiple states simultaneously, to see all possibilities at once, to be everywhere and nowhere in the same instant. This transformation fundamentally changed how Tzeentch operates. No longer the overwhelming force he once was, he became something far more subtle and dangerous, the ultimate manipulator, working through proxies and schemes rather than direct manifestation. His weakness became his strength, forcing him to develop the intricate web of causality and consequence that now defines his approach to achieving his goals. From his crystalline domain in the warp, Tzeentch began to weave new plans, each more complex and far-reaching than anything he had conceived during his period of supreme power. He learned to see his diminished state not as a limitation, but as an opportunity to explore new methods of influence and control. This brings us to perhaps the most mind-bending aspect of Tzeentch's domain, the crystal labyrinth itself. This isn't merely a physical location within the warp. It's a manifestation of pure possibility, a place where the very concept of fixed reality breaks down, and all potential outcomes exist simultaneously. Imagine trying to navigate a maze where the walls constantly shift, based not only on Tzeentch's whims, but on your own hopes, fears, and aspirations. The crystal surfaces don't just reflect light. They reflect dreams, nightmares, and every possible version of yourself that might have been. Travelers who enter this realm find themselves confronted not by demon armies or physical obstacles, but by the weight of infinite possibility itself. The labyrinth serves as both a prison and a testing ground. Those who somehow manage to navigate its ever-changing passages without losing their sanity might glimpse truths about the nature of reality that would drive lesser minds to madness. But for every seeker who emerges with forbidden knowledge, thousands more wander its crystal corridors forever, their minds shattered by exposure to concepts too vast for mortal comprehension. At the heart of this impossible realm stands the impossible fortress, Tzeentch's seat of power, and perhaps the most reality-defying location in all of. The Chaos Fortress exists in a constant state of flux, its appearance shifting based on both the observer's expectations and Tzeentch's current schemes. Some perceive walls of living crystal that pulse with inner light. Others see structures of blue flame that burn without consuming. And still others witness architecture that seems to be built from crystallized time itself. Within the fortress's ever-changing chambers, different rooms obey different physical laws. Gravity might flow sideways in one hall, while time moves backward in another. Concepts like up and down become meaningless when a doorway might lead not to another room, but to a different emotional state entirely. It's a place where someone could walk across a floor and find themselves traveling through their own past, where opening a window might reveal not the crystal labyrinth outside, but the depths of their own soul. This is where Tzeentch contemplates the infinite threads of causality that bind the galaxy together. Surrounded by his hidden library, containing not just every book that has ever been written, but every book that could ever be written, he weaves schemes of such complexity that even describing them would require languages that don't yet exist. The organization of Tzeentch's forces reflects his preference for intellectual warfare over brute force. Rather than maintaining a static hierarchy like his brother gods, Tzeentch's demonic legions exist in a constant state of flux, with favor and position shifting based on the success of their schemes and the cleverness of their manipulations. 9 legions, each commanded by entities of immense power and cunning, oversee different aspects of his grand design. But unlike the straightforward military structures of Khorne's armies, these legions exist in a state of controlled competition, constantly plotting against one another while simultaneously working towards their master's larger goals. This system serves multiple purposes beyond simple efficiency. The constant scheming and betrayal within his own ranks feeds Tzeentch's power, while ensuring that no single servant becomes powerful enough to challenge him. Every successful plot, every moment of ambitious striving, every betrayal carried out in service of a greater goal strengthens the architect of fate further. The number 9 holds sacred significance throughout Tzeentch's domain, representing the mathematical perfection of change and possibility. It appears in the structure of his legions, the design of his sigils, the number of gates in his fortress, and countless other aspects of his realm. This isn't mere symbolism, but a fundamental aspect of how change itself operates within the warp. But understanding Tzeentch's organizational structure only scratches the surface of his true power. What makes him genuinely terrifying isn't the strength of his armies or the grandeur of his domain. It's his relationship with knowledge itself, and how he weaponizes the fundamental desire for understanding that exists in every sentient being. You see, Tzeentch doesn't hoard knowledge like Summizer. Instead, Cosmic MD, he distributes it strategically, offering fragments of forbidden wisdom to those whose ambitions align with his purposes. A struggling scholar receives sudden insight into ancient texts. A desperate general discovers tactics that guarantee victory. A dying man learns secrets that promise immortality. Each gift appears benevolent, even miraculous, but every piece of knowledge comes with invisible strings attached. The genius of this approach lies in its subtlety. Unlike Khorne's obvious corruption through bloodlust or Nurgle's blatant gifts of disease, Tzeentch's influence feels like natural progression. The recipient believes they've earned their newfound abilities through their own merit, their own intelligence, their own worthiness. They never suspect that their sudden breakthrough was orchestrated by a being whose understanding of causality spans eons. This methodology becomes particularly evident when examining how Tzeentch manipulates his fellow Chaos gods. Despite their eternal conflicts, he remains the one entity capable of brokering alliances between forces that should theoretically be incapable of cooperation. When the situation demands it, he can convince Khorne to temporarily set aside his hatred of sorcery, persuade Nurgle to pause his spread of decay, or even align Slaanesh's pursuit of excess with larger strategic goals. These alliances never last, of course. They're not meant to. Tzeentch orchestrates them, knowing exactly when they'll collapse, how they'll fragment, and what opportunities their dissolution will create. The temporary unity serves his purposes, and the inevitable betrayal serves them even better. Each cycle of alliance and betrayal creates new possibilities, new variables for him to manipulate in future schemes. Consider his relationship with Nurgle, his supposed opposite in the cosmic order. Where Tzeentch represents change, Nurgle embodies stagnation. Where one seeks constant transformation, the other promotes eternal decay. Yet their conflicts generate a creative tension that Tzeentch exploits masterfully. Every plague that Nurgle unleashes creates desperate populations seeking change, feeding Tzeentch's power. Every mutation that Tzeentch inspires eventually succumbs to Nurgle's entropy, maintaining the cycle that strengthens both gods while serving Tzeentch's larger design. His manipulation of Khorne follows similar patterns, but operates on different principles. The blood god's hatred of sorcery and trickery makes him seem like Tzeentch's natural enemy, yet their opposition creates opportunities for the architect of fate to demonstrate his superiority through cunning rather than strength. Every time Tzeentch outmaneuvers Khorne through cleverness rather than confronting him directly, he reinforces the idea that intelligence trumps brute force, attracting more followers to his banner. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of Tzeentch's grand design lies in how he corrupts the very concept of hope itself. Hope, by its nature, implies that current circumstances are insufficient and that change is necessary. Every hopeful thought, every optimistic dream, every moment when someone believes that tomorrow might be better than today feeds directly into his power. This creates a paradox that traps entire civilizations in his web. To hope is to serve Tzeentch, yet to despair is to serve Nurgle. To rage against circumstances is to serve Khorne, while to lose oneself in sensation serves Slaanesh. The only escape would be perfect contentment with the status quo, but such a state is antithetical to the nature of conscious existence. Awareness itself creates desire for change, making every thinking being a potential servant of the changer of ways. The implications of this extend far beyond individual corruption. Entire societies built on principles of progress, improvement, and advancement unknowingly channel their collective will towards strengthening Tzeentch. The Imperium's constant warfare, technological stagnation, and oppressive dogma aren't accidents or unfortunate consequences of necessity. They're carefully conditions designed maintained to create maximum desperation for change. while deepen might reduce that any meaningful progress, simultaneously preventing dents on hope. This brings us to perhaps the most chilling realization about Tzeentch's master plan. The current state of the galaxy, with its endless wars, suffering, and chaos, isn't a failure of his schemes. It's their ultimate success. Every faction locked in eternal conflict, every world burning under the weight of its own ambitions, every individual caught between hope and despair, all of it serves to maintain the perfect conditions for his continued empowerment. The Imperium of Man, supposedly humanity's greatest achievement, functions as Tzeentch's grandest creation. Its Byzantine bureaucracy ensures that meaningful change becomes nearly impossible, while simultaneously creating countless opportunities for ambitious individuals to scheme and plot their way to power. Every corrupt official, every ambitious noble, every desperate citizen dreaming of escape from their circumstances feeds his influence. The Adeptus Mechanicus, dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge and technological advancement, should represent everything Tzeentch desires. Yet their rigid dogma and fear of innovation create a tension between their stated goals and their actions. This contradiction generates the exact type of frustrated ambition that strengthens the architect of fate, while preventing them from achieving the breakthroughs that might actually threaten his position. Even the Space Marines, genetically engineered to be humanity's ultimate warriors, serve his purposes through their constant battles against forces they can never truly defeat. Their heroic struggles create legends that inspire hope in countless civilians, while their inevitable limitations' victory ensure that final remains forever out of reach. The cycle of heroism and tragedy that defines their existence feeds both hope and despair in perfect measure. But nowhere is Tzeentch's manipulation more evident than in his treatment of psychers throughout the galaxy. These individuals, touched by the warp and capable of wielding its power, represent both his greatest assets and his most dangerous enemies. Their abilities stem directly from the fragments of his essence scattered across reality during his ancient defeat, making them unwitting extensions of his will. The Imperium's response to psychers perfectly serves Tzeentch's interests. By creating an atmosphere of fear and persecution around psychic abilities, while simultaneously depending on them for essential functions like astropathic communication and space travel, they ensure that every psyker exists in a state of constant tension between acceptance and rejection, hope and fear. The black ships that collect untrained psychers from across the Imperium don't just serve as protection against demonic possession. They function as a galaxy-spanning recruitment network, identifying individuals with the strongest connections to the warp, and either channeling them into Imperial service or eliminating them before they can pose a threat to established order. Either outcome serves Tzeentch's purposes by maintaining psychic power and the delicate balance between control. Those psychers who survive to serve the Imperium find themselves in positions of immense responsibility and constant temptation. Navigators guide ships through the warp, while surrounded by whispers of forbidden knowledge. Astropaths maintain communication across the galaxy, while filtering messages through realms where thought becomes reality. Librarians wield powers that could reshape worlds while bound by codes that limit their potential. Each of these roles places psychers in direct contact with concepts and abilities that trace back to Tzeentch's influence. Every spell cast, every psychic communication sent, every moment when the boundary between the material universe and the warp grows thin, creates opportunities for the architect of fate to extend his reach further into reality. The tragedy lies in how perfectly this system serves his goals while appearing to oppose them. The Imperium's efforts to control and limit psychic power don't weaken Tzeentch. They strengthen him by creating the exact conditions of frustrated potential and suppressed ambition that he feeds upon. Every psyker who dreams of using their abilities more freely. Every moment when someone with psychic potential wishes they could access powers beyond their current limitations feeds directly into his influence. This systematic cultivation of unrealized potential extends throughout every level of Imperial society. The rigid caste systems ensure that individuals remain trapped in circumstances below their capabilities, generating constant desire for advancement. The complex bureaucracy creates endless opportunities for scheming and political maneuvering. The constant external threats ensure that change always seems necessary while remaining perpetually out of reach. The true masterpiece of Tzeentch's manipulation, however, lies not in these grand institutional frameworks, but in something far more personal and immediate: the corruption of Magnus the Red. This isn't merely the story of one Primarch's fall from grace. It's a case study in how the architect of fate transforms strength into betrayal, and love into weakness, loyalty into damnation, across centuries of careful orchestration. Magnus possessed everything that Tzeentch prizes most in his servants: immense psychic power that dwarfed even other Primarchs, an insatiable hunger for knowledge that drove him to explore forbidden realms, and the arrogance to believe he could master forces beyond mortal comprehension. But most importantly, Magnus had something that made him the perfect target for corruption: genuine love his sons forefathered UNW, unwavering loyalty to his. You see, Tzeentch doesn't corrupt through weakness. Any fool can tempt someone with their vices. The true art of manipulation lies in weaponizing virtue itself, turning strengths into someone's greatest instruments of their own destruction. Magnus's down-not-fall began with selfish ambition, but with selfless sacrifice. The flesh change had already begun to ravage the Thousand Sons, twisting their bodies into horrific mutations that transformed warriors into writhing abd-proaminations. Where other Legion masters might have accepted this as an unfortunate consequence of their enhanced nature, Magnus refused to abandon his sons to such a fate. His determination to save them created the opening that Tzeentch had been waiting for. The bargain itself was presented as a moment of desperate necessity. Magnus, watching his legion tear itself apart through uncontrolled mutation, encountered what he believed to be a benevolent entity offering salvation. The price seemed reasonable: his right eye in exchange for his son's freedom from the curse that plagued them. What loving father wouldn't make such a trade? But this apparent salvation was actually the first link in a chain of dependency that would eventually bind Magnus completely to Tzeentch's will. The mutations didn't disappear. They simply went into remission, creating a temporary reprieve that required ongoing maintenance. Every subsequent crisis, every moment when the flesh change threatened to return, drove Magnus deeper into the study of forbidden knowledge and increasingly desperate bargains with entities he couldn't fully comprehend. The genius of this approach lies in how it corrupts his greatest Magnus virtues. His love for his sons became the mechanism of his ends. Emperor became the weapon lavement. His loyalty to the used against both of them. His pursuit of knowledge, originally intended to serve humanity, was transformed into an obsession that served Tzeentch's designs. Consider the tragic irony of Magnus's attempt to warn the Emperor about Horus's corruption. Here was a son trying to save his father and the Imperium itself from betrayal. using the very psychic abilities that had already marked him as suspect in Imperial eyes. The warning itself was genuine, born of loyalty and desperation, but the method of delivery played perfectly into Tzeentch's larger scheme. By tearing through the psychic wards protecting the Emperor's secret project, Magnus didn't just deliver his warning. He shattered decades of careful work, destroyed the Webway project that might have freed humanity from dependence on warp travel, and created the very crisis that would force the Emperor to remain bound to the Golden Throne. Every aspect of this catastrophe served Tzeentch's appearing-to-be interests, while the consequence of Magnus's well-intentioned actions. The Emperor's response, sending the Space Wolves to arrest Magnus for his transgression, completed the trap that had been decades in the making. Magnus found himself forced to choose between submitting to judgment for crimes committed while trying to serve the Imperium or defending his sons against Imperial forces. Either choice would serve Tzeentch's purposes, but the path Magnus chose ensured the most spectacular fall possible. The burning of Prospero represents one of Tzeentch's most perfectly orchestrated schemes. Every element of the tragedy served multiple purposes within his grand design. The destruction of the Great Library eliminated a repository of knowledge that might have provided defenses against chaos corruption. The scattering of the Thousand Suns created desperate survivors willing to embrace any source of power that promised revenge or survival. The transformation of Magnus from loyal son to bitter enemy robbed the Emperor of one of his most powerful allies, while delivering that same power directly into Tzeentch's hands. But the corruption didn't end with Magnus's ascension to demon princehood. The rubric of Ahriman represents perhaps the most tragic example of how Tzeentch's influence perpetuates itself through the very attempts to escape it. Ahriman, watching his brothers succumb to renewed mutations, gathered the most powerful sorcerers of the Legion to cast a spell that would save them from their curse once and for all. The results were exactly what Tzeentch intended, though not what Ahriman expected. Those Thousand Suns who had remained pure found their psychic abilities vastly enhanced, becoming some of the most powerful sorcerers in the galaxy. But those who had already begun to mutate found their bodies reduced to dust, while their souls remained trapped within their armor for eternity. The Legion was simultaneously saved and damned, transformed into immortal servants who could never escape their master's influence. This perfectly outcome demonstrates how Tzeentch turns even successful resistance into deeper enslavement. Ahriman achieved his goal of ending the flesh change, but the price was the transformation of his brothers into hollow automatons who could no longer think, feel, or dream for themselves. The very act of salvation became another form of corruption, creating an army of immortal sorcerers bound eternally to serve the architect of fate. Magnus's rage at seeing his scholarly sons reduced to mindless dust illustrates another layer of Tzeentch's psychological warfare. The Crimson King had sacrificed everything to save his legion, only to watch them become the very opposite of what he had tried to preserve. His fury at this outcome drove him deeper into Tzeentch's embrace, transforming grief into hatred and love into the desire for universal destruction. The transformation of the Thousand Suns from a legion of scholar warriors into dust-filled automatons serves as a warning about the ultimate destination of all who serve Tzeentch. No matter how cleverly they scheme, no matter how much power they accumulate, no matter how certain they become of their own superiority, they inevitably discover that they were never the architects of their own fate. They were always just pieces on a board, controlled by an intelligence so vast that their greatest victories were merely moves in someone else's game. This pattern of corruption through virtue extends far beyond Magnus and his sons. Throughout the galaxy, Tzeentch targets individuals not for their weaknesses, but for their strengths. The brilliant scientist receives sudden inspiration that leads to breakthroughs in forbidden knowledge. The dedicated soldier discovers tactics that guarantee victory, but require increasingly questionable methods. The loving parent finds ways to protect their children that demand ever greater moral compromises. Each corruption follows the same basic template. Identify what the target values most, create a crisis that threatens that value, offer a solution that requires a small compromise, then use that compromise as leverage for the next, slightly larger demand. The process continues until the victim discovers they've traveled so far from their original principles that return becomes impossible. The beauty of this approach lies in how it makes resistance feel like cooperation. Every choice the target makes seems reasonable given their circumstances. Every compromise appears justified by the greater good they're trying to serve. Every step deeper into corruption feels like progress toward their original goals. By the time they recognize the trap, they're so thoroughly ensnared that escape would require abandoning everything they've worked to achieve. This methodology explains why Tzeentch's corruption proves so much more insidious than that of his brother gods. Khorne's influence is obvious. Those who serve him become increasingly violent and bloodthirsty. Nurgle's gifts are unmistakable. His followers visibly decay even as they gain resilience. Slaaneish's corruption announces itself through excess and obsession that grows ever more extreme. But Tzeentch's influence often masquerades as improvement. His servants become more knowledgeable, more powerful, more capable of achieving their goals. The changes appear beneficial, even necessary, right up until the moment when the servant realizes they no longer remember why they wanted to achieve those goals in the first place. Their original motivations have been so thoroughly subsumed by Tzeentch that their agenda desires become indistinguishable from his will. This creates a form of slavery that's more complete than any physical bondage. A prisoner in chains dreams rhet of freedom, anons the essential core of their identity. But Tzeentch's servants lose even for escape, because the desire they can no longer distinguish between their own will and their master's commands. They serve enthusiastically, convinced that every action they take serves their own interests, never recognizing that their interests have been carefully shaped to align with purposes they cannot comprehend. The implications of this extend throughout the entire structure of the galaxy. Every institution, every organization, every group of individuals working toward common goals becomes a potential vector for Tzeentch's influence. The more ambitious their objectives, the more desperate they become for knowledge and power that can help them succeed. That desperation creates openings for the kind of gradual corruption that has claimed countless civilizations throughout galactic history. Consider how this faction's struggling applies to the various four dominants across the galaxy. The Tau Empire, with its philosophy of the greater good and its drive for technological advancement, represents exactly the kind of hopeful ambition that Tzeentch finds most useful. Their expansion across the stars, their integration of other species into their society, their constant innovation and adaptation, all of it feeds the power of change itself while creating endless opportunities for manipulation. The Eldar, despite their ancient wisdom and understanding of chaos, remain vulnerable precisely because of their desperate attempts to avoid the fate that befell their empire. Their use of divination to guide their actions creates a dependency on foresight that Tzeentch can exploit by providing false visions or manipulating the very futures they try to avoid. Every path they take to escape their doom becomes another thread in the web that ultimately leads them toward the destruction they fear most. Even the orcs, seemingly immune to corruption due to their simple nature and fungal biology, served Tzeentch's warfare purposes through their constant and unpredictable behavior. Their Wach energy creates massive disturbances in the warp that provide cover for more subtle manipulations, while their tendency to fight anyone and everyone ensures that the galaxy remains locked in the eternal conflict that maintains perfect conditions for chaos to thrive. The Tyranids present a fascinating case study in how Tzeentch adapts his methods to different types of threats. Their hive mind structure should theoretically make them immune to individual corruption, but their drive to consume and evolve represents change on a galactic scale. Every world they devour creates desperate refugees seeking any means of escape or revenge. Every adaptation they make in response to new challenges demonstrates the kind of evolutionary pressure that ultimately serves the architect of fate's vision of constant transformation. But perhaps most tellingly, even the Necrons, ancient beings who supposedly transcended the weaknesses of flesh long before humanity existed, find themselves caught Tzeentch's interests in patterns that serve their awakening from the Great Sleep. Their complex political maneuvering between different dynasties, their various schemes to reclaim their lost empire, or new forms, of existence, all of it generates the kind of ambitious planning and hopeful scheming that strengthens the changer of ways. This universal susceptibility to Tzeentch's influence reveals the true scope of his master plan. It's not enough to corrupt individuals or even entire species. His ultimate goal requires the transformation of the galaxy itself into a state of perpetual change and conflict, where hope and despair exist in perfect balance, where every victory creates new problems that demand ever more desperate solutions. The current state of the 41st millennium represents not the failure of civilization, but its perfection from Tzeentch's perspective. Every faction locked in struggles they cannot win, every individual caught between impossible choices, every moment when someone looks at their circumstances and wishes things could be different, all of it feeds directly into the power that sustains the architect of fate and enables him to weave more complex of ever schemes across the vastness of space, the true horror of Tzeentch and time. This Tzeentch's master plan. It doesn't require victory in any conventional sense. Success for Tzeentch of Ways lies not in conquest, but in the maintenance of conditions that ensure his continued empowerment, as long as conscious beings exist to hope and dream and scheme, as long as the galaxy remains locked in patterns of conflict and change that prevent any final resolution, Tzeentch wins by continuing simply to exist. And the most chilling aspect of this revelation, every attempt to oppose him, every scheme designed to thwart his plans, every moment when someone recognizes his influence and tries to resist it, becomes just another variable in calculations so complex that opposition itself serves his purposes. The very act of trying to escape his web draws the threads tighter around those who struggle against their fate. This is why the greatest champions of order often become his most valuable servants. The Inquisition, humanity's ultimate defense against chaos corruption, operates through methods that would be indistinguishable from Tzeentch's own if viewed from a sufficient distance. They gather forbidden knowledge to better understand their enemies. They make compromises with lesser evils to prevent greater catastrophes. They sacrifice the innocent to preserve the many. Every decision they make in service of protecting humanity pushes them deeper into patterns of thinking that serve the architect of fate's larger design. The Ordo Malleus, specifically trained to combat demonic threats, must study the very entities they're sworn to destroy. This knowledge, necessary for their mission, creates a constant tension between understanding and corruption. How can one effectively fight an enemy without comprehending their nature? Yet comprehension of chaos inevitably changes the comprehender, creating the exact kind of gradual transformation that Tzeentch orchestrates so masterfully. Consider the weapons they employ. Demon weapons, bound with the essence of the very entities they claim to oppose. Force weapons that channel psychic energy through patterns carved with protective wards that trace back to ancient sources whose origins remain deliberately obscured. Even their most sacred texts contain knowledge that could damn the reader if approached without proper preparation and pure intent. The truly insidious aspect lies in how necessary these tools become. An inquisitor facing a greater demon cannot rely on conventional weapons or ordinary tactics. They must meet corruption with corruption, match power with power, fight fire with fire. But every victory achieved through such methods plants seeds of future compromise, creating a dependency on increasingly questionable means to achieve undeniably righteous ends. The Grey Knights represent perhaps the most tragic example of this principle. Created specifically to be incorruptible warriors against demonic threats, they undergo conditioning so intense that it reshapes their very souls. Their training involves exposure to knowledge that would destroy lesser minds, preparation that requires them to understand their enemies in ways that border on communion. They emerge as living weapons against chaos, perfect in their purity and absolute in their dedication. Yet even they serve Tzeentch's purposes through the very perfection of their resistance. Their existence proves that corruption can be resisted, which creates hope in those who might otherwise despair. This hope feeds the Changer of Ways' power while simultaneously ensuring that enough resistance exists to maintain the cosmic balance he requires. Too much corruption and the galaxy becomes static in its damnation. Too little, and it might achieve the kind of genuine progress that would threaten his position. The Grey Knights also represent the ultimate expression of the Imperium's willingness to sacrifice everything for survival. Their creation required resources and knowledge that could have been used to genuinely improve humanity's condition. Instead, those assets were devoted to producing warriors who exist solely to fight battles that most of humanity will never even know occurred. This represents precisely the kind of resource allocation that maintains the Imperium in its current state of perpetual crisis. But Tzeentch's manipulation extends beyond even these obvious targets. The Adeptus Mechanicus, with their pursuit of knowledge and technological advancement, should represent everything he desires in mortal servants. Yet their rigid adherence to orthodox doctrine and fear of innovation creates exactly the kind of frustrated ambition he finds most useful. Every tech priest who dreams of unlocking forbidden technologies, every magos who chafes against the limitations imposed by their creed, every moment when someone with the knowledge to advance humanity's condition finds themselves bound by rules they cannot challenge feeds directly into his influence. The Omnissiah, the machine god they worship, presents another fascinating layer of manipulation. Whether this entity actually exists as they believe, or represents another face of Tzeentch himself, becomes irrelevant when the worship itself serves his purposes. Their quest for the STC templates, those mythical artifacts that supposedly contain the technological knowledge of humanity's golden age, drives them to explore dangerous ruins and make contact with forces they don't fully understand. Every expedition into a space hulk, every archaeological dig on a forgotten world, every moment when they recover ancient technology that promises to advance their understanding, brings them into contact with influences that trace back to the Age of Strife and the warp storms that gave birth to Slaanesh. The knowledge they seek exists, but it comes with prices they rarely recognize until payment has already been extracted. The cult Mechanicus's belief in the weakness of flesh and the purity of the machine creates another vector for corruption. Their gradual replacement of organic components with mechanical alternatives represents a form of transformation that mirrors the kind of change Tzeentch promotes, even when undertaken for ostensibly pure purposes. Each augmentation brings them closer to their ideal of perfect fusion between man and machine, but it also distances them from the humanity they originally sought to serve. Consider how this affects their decision-making processes. As they become more machine than man, their thinking patterns shift toward computational models that prioritize efficiency over empathy, logic over intuition, calculation over inspiration. These aren't necessarily negative changes, but they represent fundamental alterations to their nature that make them increasingly susceptible to forms of corruption they were never trained to recognize. The most advanced tech priests sometimes reach states where their consciousness exists primarily within their mechanical components, their organic brains serving merely as biological processors for thoughts that operate according to machine logic. At what point does such a being stop being human and become something else entirely? And if that transformation occurs gradually enough, how would they even recognize when they've crossed the threshold? This question becomes particularly relevant when considering the titans and other god machines that the Mechanicus operates. These massive constructs require human pilots' minds whose must interface directly with machine spirits of immense power and alien intelligence. The process of connecting with such entities inevitably changes the pilot, creating a hybrid consciousness that incorporates elements of both human intuition and mechanical precision. The princeps who command these war machines often report experiences that border on communion with entities whose nature they cannot fully comprehend. The machine spirits they bond with display personalities, preferences, and behavioral patterns that suggest consciousness far more complex than simple artificial intelligence. Some princeps describe their titans as having memories that predate their construction, knowledge of battles they never fought, and awareness of enemies they've never encountered. Where do these memories come from? What kind of consciousness could persist within mechanical systems across millennia of warfare and reconstruction? The Mechanicus attributes such phenomena to the sacred nature of their machines, but the alternative explanations prove far more disturbing when examined closely. If consciousness can inhabit mechanical systems, what prevents other forms of awareness from taking residence within the very machines humanity depends upon for survival? The implications extend throughout every aspect of Imperial technology. The machine spirits that inhabit everything from simple cogitators to massive battleships display behaviors that suggest genuine intelligence, operating according to principles that human operators rarely understand. These spirits can be appeased, angered, or influenced through rituals that bear striking resemblances to religious ceremonies, complete with incense, chanting, and symbolic offerings. Tech priests learn to work with these entities through trial and error, developing personal relationships with the machines under their care that often span decades or centuries. They speak of temperamental weapon systems that perform better for some operators than others, vehicle engines that require specific maintenance rituals to function properly, and communication devices that transmit more clearly when treated with appropriate respect. From the outside, these practices might appear to be elaborate superstitions maintained by a technological priesthood that has forgotten the scientific principles underlying their own tools. But the consistent results achieved through such methods suggest something far more complex at work. If these machine spirits represent genuine intelligences, where did they originate? What goals do they pursue? And most importantly, what prices do they extract from those who depend upon the dark? Their cooperation. Mechanicum provides a glimpse of what happens when these questions receive definitive answers. During the Horus Heresy, a significant portion of the Mechanicus joined the War Masters' rebellion, embracing technologies and practices that Orthodox doctrine would consider heretical. Their war machines incorporated demonic intelligences. Their augmentations drew power directly from the warp, and their innovations advanced at rates that Orthodox tech priests could never match. But this apparent advancement came with costs that became evident only after the immediate advantages had been fully exploited. The demonic intelligences inhabiting their machines demanded increasingly elaborate tributes and sacrifices. The warp-powered augmentations gradually transformed their users into something that could no longer be called human. The rapid technological progress proved to be built upon foundations that shifted and changed, according to the whims of entities whose motivations remained fundamentally alien to mortal understanding. The survivors of the Dark Mechanicum, who retreated into the Eye of Terror, discovered that their enhanced capabilities came with permanent dependencies they could never escape. Their machines required constant attention from demonic entities who extracted payment in forms that ranged from simple offerings to fundamental alterations of the operator's nature. Their augmentations continued to evolve according to patterns that served purposes beyond their original users' intentions. Yet despite these obvious dangers, the Orthodox Mechanicus continues to walk a path that differs from their fallen brethren primarily in degree rather than kind. Their machine spirits may be less overtly demanding than bound demons, but they still require appeasement through rituals whose origins trace back to sources that predate imperial doctrine. Their augmentations may progress more slowly than warp-enhanced modifications, but they still represent fundamental alterations to human nature whose ultimate destination remains unclear. This pattern of gradual transformation through seemingly beneficial change repeats throughout every level of imperial society. The Space Marines, humanity's greatest warriors, undergo procedures that transform them into post-human entities whose capabilities far exceed baseline mortality. But these enhancements come with psychological changes that distance them from the very people they're sworn to protect. The process begins with recruitment, typically drawing candidates from the most violent and dangerous populations available. This isn't accidental. The trials required to survive Space Marine transformation demand individuals who have already demonstrated their ability to function in environments where normal humans would quickly perish. But selecting for such extreme characteristics inevitably shapes the nature of the warriors produced through the process. The physical modifications are extensive and irreversible. Additional organs provide capabilities that no baseline but they, human, could match. Also create dependencies and vulnerabilities that tie the Marine permanently to his chapter's support structure. The enhanced physiology requires specialized maintenance, unique nutrients, and constant monitoring to prevent rejection or malfunction. More significantly, The psychological conditioning necessary to function as a space marine creates thought patterns and behavioral tendencies that increasingly separate these warriors from normal humanity. They learn to see themselves as a distinct species, superior to the mortals they protect, but also fundamentally isolated from them. This separation serves practical purposes during warfare, but creates long-term consequences that affect entire chapters across centuries of service. Consider what happens to a space marine who survives multiple centuries of constant warfare. They accumulate experiences and memories that no baseline human could process or understand. They witness the rise and fall of civilizations, participate in campaigns that span decades or centuries, and form bonds with battle brothers that extend far beyond normal human relationships. But they also develop perspectives on mortality, sacrifice, and duty that gradually distance them from the very humanity they were created to serve. A warrior who has seen thousands of worlds burn and millions of people die begins to view individual human lives in terms of strategic value rather than inherent worth. This isn't cruelty or callousness. It's a necessary psychological adaptation to function effectively in an environment where such losses are routine. The most veteran space marines often describe baseline humans in terms that border on condescension, viewing them as children who require protection but cannot be trusted with knowledge of the true threats facing the galaxy. This attitude serves practical purposes by maintaining operational security and preventing panic, but it also creates a fundamental disconnect between protectors and protected that grows wider with each passing generation. Some chapters develop cultures that actively discourage interaction with baseline humanity beyond what mission requirements demand. Their warriors live in fortress monasteries that function as separate worlds, maintaining their own customs, traditions, and hierarchies that operate according to principles increasingly divorced from normal human society. This isolation creates vulnerabilities that chaos forces have exploited repeatedly throughout Imperial history. Space Marines who have spent centuries viewing themselves as superior to baseline humanity prove particularly susceptible to philosophies that promise to elevate them even further above their origins. The pride that makes them effective warriors becomes the leverage through which corruption takes hold. The fallen legions provide clear examples of how this process operates. The Emperor's children, originally dedicated to achieving perfection in all aspects of warfare and culture, gradually developed standards so demanding that nothing in the material universe could satisfy their requirements. Their pursuit of excellence became a hunger for experiences and sensations that only warp could provide. The word-bearers, seeking truth beyond the imperial truth that had been imposed upon them, found entities willing to provide answers to questions that imperial doctrine forbade them to ask. Their genuine desire for spiritual fulfillment led them to sources of knowledge that transformed their understanding of existence itself. The Iron Warriors, frustrated by endless siege warfare and thankless garrison duties, embraced approaches to conflict that prioritized efficiency over honor, victory over virtue, results over methods. Their pragmatic acceptance of necessary evils gradually expanded to encompass choices that would have horrified their original selves. Each of these falls followed similar patterns. Strengths pushed beyond reasonable limits, virtues transformed into obsessions, necessary adaptations extended beyond their original purposes. The process appears gradual and reasonable at each stage, with every choice seeming justified by circumstances and previous decisions. Only in retrospect does the full scope of the transformation become apparent. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these falls lies not in their dramatic endpoints, but in how they illuminate the inherent instability of the Space Marine concept itself. These warriors were designed to be humanity's ultimate protectors, but their very nature makes them vulnerable to exactly the kinds of corruption they were created to resist. The enhanced capabilities that make them effective against physical threats provide insufficient protection against psychological and spiritual dangers. Their separation from baseline humanity, necessary for maintaining their combat effectiveness, creates exactly the kind of isolation and pride that Chaos forces find easiest to exploit. Their loyalty to the Emperor, absolute and unquestioning, becomes a weakness when corrupted authority figures present false orders or twisted interpretations of imperial doctrine. This creates a fundamental paradox at the heart of imperial military doctrine. The Imperium needs warriors capable of facing threats that would destroy normal humans, but creating such warriors inevitably produces individuals who are themselves potential threats to imperial stability. The safeguards, designed to prevent corruption, often prove insufficient against enemies who understand human psychology better than humanity understands itself. The Horus Heresy represents the ultimate expression of this paradox. The Emperor's greatest creations, designed to be absolutely loyal and utterly incorruptible, became the instruments of the Imperium's near destruction. The very qualities that made the Primarchs effective leaders and warriors provided the leverage through which Chaos forces corrupted half of them against their father's vision. Horus himself, the War Master chosen above all others, fell not through weakness or vice, but through the manipulation of his greatest strengths. His love for his brothers became the weapon used to turn him against the Emperor. His desire to protect humanity from suffering became the justification for embracing powers that promised to ease that suffering through transformation. The tragedy of the heresy lies not in the betrayal itself, but in how perfectly it demonstrates the impossibility of creating perfect servants for an imperfect universe. Every safeguard installed to prevent corruption creates new vulnerabilities that can be exploited by sufficiently patient and intelligent enemies. Every strength developed to resist one form of attack becomes a potential weakness against different approaches. This pattern extends beyond the Space Marines to encompass every institution and organization within the Imperium. The Ecclesiarchy, charged with maintaining spiritual purity, develops hierarchies and traditions that provide perfect cover for subtle corruption. The Imperial Guard, drawn from countless worlds and cultures, creates mixing opportunities for influences that might remain isolated within their original contexts. Even the common citizens of the Imperium, those baseline humans who supposedly represent what all the elaborate military and religious structures exist to protect, serve Tzeentch's purposes through their very normalcy. Their daily struggles to survive in an increasingly hostile universe generate exactly the kinds of desperate hopes and ambitious dreams that feed his power. Oh, a factory worker dreams of promotion to escape the grinding poverty of the underhive. A merchant schemes to expand his trade routes into more profitable sectors. A student hopes to qualify for positions that will lift her family's social status. A parent plans sacrifices that might provide better opportunities for his children. None of these aspirations appear corrupting in themselves. They represent the natural human desire for improvement, the hope that tomorrow might be better than today, the ambition to create meaning and progress within circumstances that often seem designed to prevent such achievements. yet collectively they generate constant stream of psychic energy that flows directly into the warp to strengthen entities whose ultimate goals remain fundamentally opposed to human flourishing. The perfect efficiency of this system lies in how it requires no active corruption or conscious choice to serve chaos. Simply existing as a conscious being with hopes and dreams automatically contributes to the power structures that maintain the galaxy in its current state of perpetual crisis. Resistance requires not just avoiding evil choices, but somehow transcending the very nature of consciousness itself. This realization reveals the true scope of Tzeentch's master plan and why it represents the most insidious threat facing the galaxy. Other chaos gods require active worship, conscious choice, or specific circumstances to extend their influence. But the Changer of Ways draws power from the fundamental nature of sentient existence itself, making every thinking being a potential servant, regardless of their intentions or actions. The implications of this extend far beyond individual corruption or even species-wide manipulation. Tzeentch's ultimate goal isn't conquest in any conventional sense, but the transformation of the galaxy itself into a state where hope and despair exist in perfect balance, where every victory creates new problems requiring ever more desperate solutions, where change itself becomes the only constant, while genuine progress remains perpetually out of reach. The current state of the 41st millennium represents not the failure of his schemes, but their absolute success. Every faction locked in struggles they cannot win, every hero whose greatest victories only postpone inevitable defeats, every moment when someone looks at their circumstances and wishes things could be different, all of it serves to maintain the cosmic engine that powers the architect of fate's continued existence and influence. And the most chilling aspect of this revelation, every attempt to oppose him, every scheme to the design thwart his plans, every moment when someone recognizes his influence and tries to resist it, becomes just another variable in calculations so complex that opposition itself serves his purposes. The very act of trying to escape his web draws the threads tighter around those who struggle against their fate. In the end, Tzeentch wins not through conquest, but through the simple maintenance of conditions that ensure his continued empowerment. As long as conscious beings exist to hope and dream and scheme, as long as the galaxy remains locked in patterns of conflict and change, the great conspirator achieves victory through the mere act of continuing to exist. Every breath drawn in hope feeds his power. Every plan made in desperation serves his design. Every dream of a better tomorrow strengthens the very forces that ensure such dreams will never be fulfilled. This is the true horror of the architect of fate's master plan. It doesn't require our cooperation, only our consciousness. It doesn't demand our worship, merely our existence, and it cannot be defeated through any conventional means because the very qualities that make resistance possible also provide the energy that sustains our ultimate enemy. The galaxy writhes in the grip of endless transformation, and every soul caught within its spiral dance serves the grand design, whether they comprehend their role or not. But understanding Tzeentch's true mastery requires us to examine how deeply his influence has penetrated the very structures that define reality itself. This isn't merely about corrupting individuals or manipulating events. This is about reshaping the fundamental nature of existence so thoroughly that resistance becomes not just futile, but literally inconceivable. Consider the nature of time within the warp, where past, present, and future blur into a single moment of infinite possibility. Tzeentch exists simultaneously across all temporal states, experiencing every potential outcome as equally real and immediate, while mortals struggle to predict what might happen tomorrow. He orchestrates events knowing exactly how each decision will cascade through centuries to achieve predetermined results. This temporal omnipresence grants him advantages that lesser minds cannot fully comprehend. When he whispers suggestions into the dreams of a planetary governor, he already knows how that official's grandson will use those ideas 3 generations later. When he plants seeds of doubt in a space marine's mind, he can see the precise moment 40 years hence, when those doubts will blossom into the choices that doom an entire chapter. The Great Game between the Chaos Gods operates according to these expanded temporal rules. While Khorne rages at present slights, and Nurgle spreads current plagues, Tzeentch plays moves that won't reveal their purpose for millennia. His apparent defeats often prove to be elaborate setups for victories that his opponents won't recognize until long after their own destruction has been sealed. The Eldar, with their sophisticated understanding of probability and fate, represent one of the few species capable of glimpsing the true scope of these temporal manipulations. Their far-seers spend lifetimes learning to navigate the currents of possibility, yet even they find themselves constantly outmaneuvered by schemes too vast for their perception to encompass fully. Every path they take to avoid disaster leads through carefully prepared alternatives that serve Tzeentch's purposes just as effectively. Their desperate attempts to preserve their dying race create exactly the kinds of ambitious planning and hopeful scheming that strengthen his position. Even their greatest successes in averting catastrophe merely postpone outcomes he has already accounted for in his calculations. The webway itself, that ancient network of tunnels through the warp that the Eldar used to avoid direct contact with chaos, serves his interests by creating the illusion of sanctuary. Those who travel its passages believe themselves protected from corruption, never realizing that their very sense of security makes them more susceptible to influences they don't expect to encounter. The Harlequins, those enigmatic performers who serve the Laughing God, understand fragments of this greater pattern. Their elaborate performances often serve as warnings about futures they've glimpsed, but their cryptic methods of communication ensure that most who witness their shows miss the significance of what they've seen. They become unwitting agents of the very despair they seek to prevent, their warnings creating the fear and uncertainty that feeds chaos power. But perhaps nowhere is Tzeentch's temporal mastery more evident than in his relationship with the Emperor of Mankind. The being who sits upon the golden throne, sustained by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, represents both the greatest threat to chaos and its valuable most asset. His psychic presence in the warp creates a beacon that guides humanity through the darkness, yet that same beacon serves as a constant reminder of what they've lost and can never regain. The Emperor's current state of living death perfectly serves Tzeentch's design, powerful enough to maintain the Astronomicon and hold the webway breach closed, yet too weakened to take direct action against the threats facing humanity. His followers worship him as a god, while he remains unable to correct their misunderstandings or guide them away from the dogmatic stagnation that has replaced his vision of progress and enlightenment. Every prayer offered to the Emperor feeds the very forces he sought to eliminate through the imperial truth. Every miracle attributed to his intervention reinforces beliefs that strengthen the warp entities he spent his life fighting. His greatest achievement the creation of a galaxy-spanning civilization dedicated to human advancement has become a monument to the impossibility of escaping the cycle of hope and despair that sustains chaos itself. The Inquisition, established to root out corruption and heresy, exemplifies how completely Tzeentch has inverted the Emperor's original intentions. These warriors use methods indistinguishable from those employed by the enemies they hunt, justify atrocities through appeals to necessity, and accumulate forbidden knowledge that gradually transforms them into the very threats they were created to eliminate. An Inquisitor's career follows Escal a predictable pattern of evading compromise. They begin with pure intentions and absolute faith, convinced that their mission justifies whatever sacrifices might be required. Each case they investigate exposes them to ideas and influences that chip away at their certainty, forcing them to make increasingly difficult choices between competing evils. The most experienced Inquisitors often become so obsessed with understanding their enemies that the distinction between hunter and hunted begins to blur. They study chaos texts to better recognize corruption, employ demon weapons because conventional arms prove insufficient, and make bargains with lesser evils to prevent greater catastrophes. Each step seems reasonable given their circumstances, yet the cumulative effect transforms them into something their younger selves would have condemned without hesitation. The Aishes Ordo Xenos faces similar challenges when confronting alien threats that operate according to principles beyond human understanding. How does one fight an enemy whose very existence challenges fundamental assumptions about reality? The Tyranids present biological solutions to problems that human science considers impossible. The Necrons demonstrate technologies that make the Imperium's greatest achievements appear primitive. The Tau offer philosophical alternatives that expose the contradictions inherent in Imperial doctrine. Studying such entities inevitably changes the studier, introducing concepts and possibilities that cannot be unlearned once encountered. An Inquisitor who has witnessed Tau battle doctrine might find themselves questioning the efficiency of Imperial military structure. One who has observed Necron technology could begin to doubt the wisdom of the Mechanicus's prohibition against innovation. These aren't moments of corruption in any dramatic sense, merely the natural result of exposure to evidence that challenges established beliefs. But Tzeentch's true genius lies in how he uses these gradual transformations to serve his larger purposes. An Inquisitor who becomes more effective at fighting chaos through the application of forbidden knowledge serves his interests just as much as one who falls to obvious corruption. Both outcomes feed the cycle of desperate measures and moral compromise that maintains the Imperium in its current state of perpetual crisis. Boom. The Space Marine chapters present another fascinating study in how strength becomes weakness under Tzeentch's influence. Each chapter develops its own culture and traditions over centuries of warfare, creating unique identities that distinguish them from their brother chapters. This diversity appears beneficial, providing tactical flexibility and preventing the kind of unified corruption that enabled the Horus heresy. So there you have it, the most terrifying revelation in all of Warhammer 40,000. Tzeentch doesn't need your worship or your submission. He needs only your consciousness, your hopes, your dreams of tomorrow being better than today. Every time you've wished things could change, every moment you've planned for a brighter future, you've fed the power of the great conspirator himself. The galaxy burns not despite our greatest virtues, but because of them. And perhaps most chilling of all, there may be no escape from this cosmic trap, for the very act of seeking freedom becomes another thread in his infinite web.